AudioJungle.
When I think about what we've achieved as an industry in the last 10 years or so, I don't think we would have achieved even half of what we have without very strong collaborations and partnerships. And I don't just mean the private side, so among the biopharmaceuticals, the biotechs, venture capital, and private equity, but also, of course, among academia, among legislature, among patients, advocates, and on the payer side, of course, as well. Thinking about our company, EMD Serono, which is the US subsidiary of Merck KGaA in Darmstadt, Germany, that certainly applies to us as well. So when I think about maybe just two examples that come to mind in terms of partnerships, at the end of last year, we initiated a partnership with Pfizer on our anti-PD-L1 immunotherapy, avelumab, where together we're initiating up to 20 development programs this year alone, with more to follow. And the strength of that partnership has really helped us to do so. Another partnership is Threshold Pharmaceuticals out of the West Coast and San Francisco, and we're expecting the registration studies to complete in the next few months in pancreatic and soft tissue sarcoma. But we all in the room have examples of very strong partnerships that we've been in over the years, and we have others like Entrexon in the CAR-T space, Illumina, we heard from the Illumina CEO earlier in the next generation diagnostic space, Sutro and Mersana, which happens to be around the corner from here in the ADC space, and others also. But all that being said, at the end of the day, we're still in a crisis situation. And although the survival rates, especially for cancers like breast and prostate, have increased, although if you look at the drug development, 10 years ago, there were 400 drugs in development. Now we have 1,400. Still, the survival rates are not acceptable. And as an industry, we have to work together in order to address this crisis. In the US, I'm trying to remember the latest American Cancer Society statistics. In the US, there'll be 1.6 million new cases of cancer this year, almost 600,000 deaths. And globally, by 2030, that's going to increase to 22 million new cancer cases and 13 million deaths. So altogether, we have to work to make sure in partnerships, in collaborations, data sharing is something that will be discussed in the panel as well. We're proud members of the Project Data Sphere, which you'll hear about later on, in terms of mining and sharing of data. And we can only achieve that all together as partners across all the disciplines in which we work. So Vivek, thank you very much, and over to you to introduce our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Paris. Thank you very much. and thank you for that excellent introduction. So I think, really we're here to discuss collaboration, as Paris has said, and we're delighted that we've got people here representing, I guess, front and center of nexuses of collaborative working, and we're going to hear from the different perspectives. So introducing to my left then, we've got Martin Murphy, Chief Executive and CEO of Roundtable on Cancer, going to be talking about the Data Sphere initiative, is that right? Debra Patt, Medical Director of Outcomes Research, US Oncology Network, and Paul Wallace, who is Chief Medical Officer at Optum Labs. So I'm going to really ask each of you to describe, from your perspective, from what you're doing, how, maybe with some real examples, how this collaboration is being brought together, and how you are enhancing this process of not just drug discovery is the title, but also improved outcomes, which is ultimately the aim. So, to you, Martin, first.
Thank you, Viv. Thank you very much for the invitation, and to Merck's EMD Serono for your support that has enabled this part of the conference to go on. It's been a rewarding experience already. What I'd like to do, and am charged with, is to introduce to some of you Project DataSphere, and to others give you a bit of a progress report, and of course I'll try and be brief. For an Irishman, that's an oxymoron. The CEO Roundtable on Cancer was started by the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, some 15 years ago. And it was an intention by the President, as he remains our honorary chairman to this day, to have corporations where CEOs drive and do what? They set the agenda. And once they set the agenda, they're measured against that agenda. They're doers. So it was that the President said, with regards to cancer, has ever the private sector at that level, at the C-suite level, really been engaged? And the answer is, not really. Anecdotally, yes, but not truly really. And so it was that the President ventured and asked a number of us, myself and Bob Ingram, who was then running a company called Glaxo Wellcome, before it merged with SmithKline Beecham to become the GSK of today, to frame around a table chief executive officers from a variety of different industries. Some years after it was started, and I'll not go into those details now, you can see it on the web if you like, but some years after that, we looked out and we saw amongst all of these CEOs that in fact, essentially all of the big pharma CEOs were there, some of the top tier biotech, CROs, an outstanding computer company, and we posited that if they got together and were challenged and with the opportunity to do something together, that none of them, no matter how large they were, and there were the biggest pharmaceuticals in the world, none of them could do if they were to try it alone. And that became the Life Sciences Consortium of the CEO Roundtable, this subset, because they're committed to, like Paris, the life sciences in terms of the development and delivery of improved drugs. From that, over 8 years, came what I think was something that the President actually charged us with by being, because when we were asked, Mr. President, it's a great honor to serve, but what is it, sir, that you want us to do? What will success look like? He gave us 3 words. He said, I want you to be bold and venturesome. That's what this Project DataSphere is all about. 8 years in the making. In April of last year, 2014, it was opened. And open being what? It's a sphere in which anyone here in this room, give me 3 days time after you fill out an application online. It'll take you about 2 minutes. Within 3 days, you'll have the keys to the kingdom. You'll have these data sets that are derived from clinical trial data sets at the patient level, anonymized, and most of them, very importantly, curated. They are high-quality data sets provided by whom? By the members of the Life Sciences Consortium. So there is a host of big pharma and now top-tier biotech that are, and many of you in this room are really responsible for making this happen. And I salute you for providing these data inside Project DataSphere, where you can go in, strap on the SAS Advanced Analytical Tool Belt, free of any charge for as long as you're in the sphere, interrogate these data sets, pull them down, aggregate them. I said they were curated, so they're pristine. Begin to ask and answer questions to make new discoveries of old data, the like of which no one has ever had the opportunity to do before. So one last comment. Is there a proof of principle that says it's more than just big data, big curated, pristine data, but is there something that you can point to, Marty, in which some progress might have been made? And although I can't give you the details, because Viv is going to give me the hook, I can say that stay tuned, there's going to be an important paper, probably in a journal that comes out of a Massachusetts Medical Society. I can't remember the name of that one. Somewhere around here, that is going to be first authored by Tito Fojo, and those of you who know Tito from his years at the National Cancer Institute, has taken what is now the largest set of prostate cancer data and analyzed these data with regards to PSA answering and addressing some fundamental issues that is revealing some interesting, rather novel aspects about the biology of that hormone-driven tumor that has never yet been predicted before. And we think we have some new information about that, which will really have an impact on the care of metastatic prostate cancer patients going forward in the future. It is something that if I feel proud of it, it's not that we did it, it's that you did it. Those of you in industry came together under the rubric of partnership to provide progress, which is the predicate of hope. And that's what the CEO Roundtable is all about. Thank you for that opportunity.
I wanted a specific example. I couldn't ask for more. Thank you.
I will send you all reprints when it's published.
Thank you very much. Deborah.
So I'm a medical oncologist. I practice in Austin, Texas as a partner in Texas Oncology, which is a part of a large network of community oncologists called the US Oncology Network. We're around 1,000 doctors in total, all different oncology specialists that touch oncology. And, we depend very heavily on collaboration to try to advance drug discovery. One, because as a network of a nation of independent practices, we all work together on clinical research, on a singular clinical research platform through the US Oncology Network, and have participated in many clinical trials to facilitate, FDA-approved therapies in cancer care. So we depend very heavily on collaboration, and that collaboration allows me in Austin, Texas, to have 70 clinical trials open at my cancer center, which for a community practitioner is a great feat to allow patients to get cancer care close to their home. But as we've talked about, despite many successes, truly best time in the world to be an oncologist because there's many successes, but clinical trials have limitations. We've talked about limitations in design. We've talked about limitations in expense. We haven't talked about the fact that only 3% of adult cancer patients in this country enroll on prospective clinical trials. So while clinical trials are critically important about how we move forward, really, what can we learn from other patients? Because as a community practitioner, one thing I know is that while there's a small number of patients that are selected for clinical trial accrual in the prospective setting, those patients in general don't have a history of other cancers. They don't have a history of comorbid illness. They generally are healthy, wealthier, maybe better looking, than an average patient to enroll in a prospective clinical trial. And so how do you then extrapolate that data to understand how we use new drugs in real patients, patients who have had other cancers, patients who are maybe older, have a diminished performance status, maybe have an elevated creatinine level. And so as I direct outcomes research, this is a great interest of mine. How do we learn from all that data? Of the nearly 250,000 new cancer patients we see as a network every year, how do we learn from all of those patients? And so, we are using we have an oncology-specific electronic health record that has many structured data elements that are very specific for cancer. So, drug dose, laboratory values, histopathologic characteristics. So more structured data elements than you would usually get out of a health record. How can you use those to make meaning? And so we've just started a collaboration with a group called PCCI that does predictive analytics to try to understand what are the determinants that lead to a bad outcome in cancer patients. Can we predict? Can we look at the determinants of things like renal function, comorbid illness, history of previous cancer, age, performance status, and learn more than we just did from that prospective clinical trial? Then use those determinants to understand outcome and go back to put it in the front side operations of the system and learn from that healthcare system and have it nudge clinical decision support to inform decision making for clinicians and patients as they sit at the bedside. That's where I see collaboration today. I'll say that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in collaboration. There are many things that we need to do, but I think reaching out to partners to get more from the information we currently have is really fat, ripe, low-hanging fruit.
And I will come to you, Paul, in a second, but just one quick question. Are you getting interest from the academic R&D community or the industrial R&D community to use these data to identify where needs are, where gaps are, or how indeed new products could be developed?
I think, yes, there's a lot of interest in doing this. I think that everyone has that interest because we all understand the tech is there for the power of big data. There are barriers in healthcare that are specific. There are policy barriers. There are barriers that these are assets for different organizations. There are collaboration challenges. HIPAA, is a non-trivial issue, very important. So there are many barriers, but there's a tremendous interest in pursuing this. I think that oftentimes organizations are limited because it does take a large infrastructure investment to do this kind of predictive analytics and to use big data in healthcare to make meaning. And many of our organizations don't have an organizational structure that are set up to support that kind of development. Oftentimes, as I talk to clinicians about their work, as I've led health outcomes research for 7 years now for US Oncology, there's this perception that you sort of press a few buttons and get an answer, not that you sort of have to think about the question that you want, have a statistical analysis plan, like you would any kind of research. It's all about good questions, as one of the previous panelists said. So there's tremendous interest. I think that the capabilities there are more limited in healthcare and in healthcare organizations.
Thank you. Paul, from Optum Labs, huge amounts of data there from Optum. So how are you using that?
Sure. Well, again, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. It's been really engaging this morning, and particularly engaging to me around the quality of the questions that people are asking. The way people are actually confronting some big issues that I think have been a little bit out of reach until quite recently, but are beginning to come into reach. And that's actually a lot of the genesis for Optum Labs. I know we've talked a lot about big data, or at least bigger data, but one of the things that we've been really interested in is, as data becomes more abundant and more diverse, how does it actually enable us to confront bigger problems? And so I think we ought to define the utility of data not by how many whatevers you got. It ought to be the quality of the questions that you can ask and your ability to actually generate answers that real people can use. So we've had an opportunity to think about, what would that really mean in a practical term. So I think many people here are familiar with Optum. Optum is the health services portion of United Health Group. There's another fairly large portion of United Health Group, which is United Health Care, the benefits and insurance entity, but Optum is a separate company. And a lot of what we do is around data and analytics and consulting. And so we also have a lot of data. And we have a lot of data, claims data that goes back 20 years on about 150 million people. We have EHR data that goes back close to a decade now on about 45 million people. All of which is in a de-identified form that can be linked and used for health services research. We also have the opportunity to incorporate into that other kinds of data as a strategic need arises. So we also have incorporated in a great deal of socioeconomic status type data and consumer type data. And the goal here is to actually understand not so much the diseases that patients have, but to understand the patients who have the diseases, and realize that that's probably a very important complement to the kind of supply chain that we've heard this morning about creating ideas that can be translated. It's also thinking about who's the audience that these are going to be translated for. So about 3 years ago now, at Optum, we had a discussion with Mayo Clinic where we were sort of thinking about, as data becomes more available and more abundant and diverse, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for figuring out how to leverage these data resources for the kinds of things that we were interested in. And we thought about what would it really take to maximize the yield on this kind of an effort. So we figured, well, let's create an entity. That's Optum Labs. We're a small group that live across the Charles River in Cambridge. But we also thought about what would it take to actually get the most out of data in the shortest period of time. And we thought there were really three elements. One was to be highly strategic around data. It really isn't about having all of the data you can imagine. It's thinking what's the critical data that you need in order to ask big questions. The second part about it was partners. And it was thinking about not just having one or two partners, not just having the limited perspective of an Optum and a Mayo, even though that's a reasonably robust perspective. It's also realizing there are a lot of other stakeholders. There are consumers, so AARP is one of our partners. Delivery systems are very important. So the American Medical Group Association, which touches 100,000 physicians and 100 million Americans, is a partner. Several life sciences companies are partners, several academics are partners, technology companies are partners. So we have about 20 partners now, and the intent was to not only bring in ideas, but also recognize there's a necessary creative tension we have to work through if we're going to actually be able to leverage this data. The third part, in addition to data assets and partners, was design. And it was recognizing that there are a variety of different outlets for good design, but they really had three forms that we were interested in. We were interested in designing for translation. So thinking about what were the big ideas that we could test in a way that they actually could be used by clinicians and patients. We were interested in creating an environment where data could be used for innovation, where it was actually permissive to ask heretical ideas and pursue them through and create a place where we could work with investors. And then it was also to, in addition to thinking about how we could work closely with, with delivery systems and with patients, it was to ensure that we also created a place where it would create commercial products, because I think it was mentioned earlier today that things aren't going to spread if we don't figure out how they actually work in the marketplace. So I was thinking about all three dimensions there also. So we've been fortunate to have about 3 years now. We can support investigator-initiated research, and we have about 120 projects that have gone through. But we've also increasingly convened around big projects that perhaps we've failed as a health system historically. Cancer is obviously on the list. One of the areas, though, that we've been particularly interested in is heart failure, where, as a health system, we fail pretty consistently in offering good care to people with heart failure. We have a variety of things that we can do, and we can go through those mechanistically. But what we do a really poor job of is matching the therapy to the patient and recognizing what have creative clinicians been doing out in practice that actually would bring benefit to patients. So a lot of the overall paradigm is also thinking, and I think it was mentioned earlier several times today, that there are N of 1 trials going on all of the time. Every patient who's treated is an N of 1 trial. And we have isolated ourselves from the results of those trials to the detriment of the people we're supposed to serve. Now, one of the benefits of data becoming abundant is that no longer needs to be a characteristic of the system. So we think a lot of the opportunity is to really think collaboratively as we have these really rich resources. How can we design better trials? How can we actually do post-marketing surveillance? But also, how can we create an infrastructure that allows us to leverage practice-based learning as an additional source of evidence generation? So we think that sort of collaboration and that sort of infrastructure is ultimately enabled by data, but there's also a fair amount of social engineering involved too. So that's sort of where we're grounded. We frankly have not done that much with cancer yet because the strategic questions haven't been framed in a way. But we see that there's a great deal of opportunity, particularly as we talked about, cancer is going to be a disease of older people. Most of us aren't going to die of heart disease. But we are likely to have a cancer, increasingly as heart disease becomes less and less prevalent. So it is about us. We better get going, but we also have to think about how does that actually play out. And so I think our incentives are reasonably well aligned around that, I think.
So are there any, I'm going to come to the audience with questions, and remember you can use the app or you can wave your hand, either. And if there's any right now, otherwise I have some. Okay, so I want to ask each of you then, because you represent 3 organizations that are doing this, gathering data and using it to improve outcomes. I suspect there are more organizations than that. What's the connectivity between all of you? Because surely there is power in that coming together. And if that's not happening, why not? And that's to any of you, I guess, whoever wants to go first.
I'll take a swing at it. Project Datasphere, of course, is a 501c3 nonprofit adjunct of the CEO Roundtable that itself is nonprofit. And the intention is actual collaboration at every avenue, so that the collaboration exists when any researcher anywhere would like to interrogate pristine patient-level data that's been de-identified. So I'll give you an example of a type of collaboration that we instigated, which was crowdsourcing. We gathered together a group of esteemed prostate cancer oncologists who posed a series of 3 questions that all the prostate data in the Project Datasphere, which is, as I said before, now the largest prostate cancer data set in the world, that data should be able to address these questions. And then it was crowdsourced for 3 months. Over 1,000 researchers of all sorts around the world formed a total of 64 different teams and provided solutions. And now it's now been closed, and it is now being reviewed as to who were the best solvers. And they will receive a total of over $100,000 in grants and a couple of publications, and will actually present at the Prostate Cancer Research Foundation retreat. And that was an indication by that crowdsourcing of how actually you could instigate collaboration, because when we sliced and diced and asked the folks, what is your background? About 35% were in medicine. All the rest were in biostats, engineering, plasma physicists, around the world, because it's the data that attracted them. And crowdsourcing is, and I think, an example of that. We'll see what those answers were. They'll be published, and you'll all know of that as well. But I think it's an example of when you have these enormous data sets, you can actually seed the pot. You can actually go out and ask questions that will attract individuals. And now these ersatz teams are thinking up the next crowdsourcing, which will likely be in breast cancer. I hope that was an example that will give you an idea. And of course, for all of you, the intention is, why are we here? It's to let you know about Project Datasphere. Please go to projectdatasphere.org. Collaborate.
I think it's a question of strategy, really. I mean, in a sense, what I mean by that is that, have you asked the big enough strategic question where the only way it can be responded to is through collaboration?
Yeah.
So, and I think cancer is actually a really interesting area, because as we increasingly recognize the rarity of each individual condition, it's going to take huge volumes of data in order to create the reference population so that any N of one can be compared to many N's of one just like them. So that's going to be bigger probably than almost any organization. That's an interesting national initiative. That's a big strategic problem that people can get aligned around. But most of the problems that we frame now as strategic problems, frankly, it's not worth the hassle. And it's also, it gets into all kinds of intellectual property and other things. So I think the issue is actually to frame the problem as a big enough challenge. Yeah. And I think, other fields have done this. Why do you think why do we think we have big colliders, at least in some countries? Yeah. Why do we, and so I think that there is the ability to frame the problem as a big enough strategic challenge. But I would say that the reason that, and people will then align, collaborate, and form coalitions to address the problem to the magnitude it's framed. That's a little bit purposefully naive, but I think it is a way to think about it.
So I think people do collaborate more. I know that we reach out to many collaborators, as I mentioned, the US Oncology collaboration with PCCI, and have many pharmaceutical collaborators to ask important questions, and have reached out to other groups for collaboration. But I think that there are clear barriers to optimal collaboration from a free world where everyone has the capability to look at data. I mean, one is that for all organizations that invest in data, data is an asset, and it's not just that it's patient data, but the organization of that data, the infrastructure required to store that data and make sure that it's in appropriate format to be able to do statistical analysis, the resources in terms of human capital that you require to be able to do that kind of work. So those are all investments for any group. And so the data in that way is an asset because of the infrastructure and resources required to use it. There are policy barriers. There is state variability in policy that governs how we interact with patients, and certainly national policy around HIPAA. The importance of de-identification, that's a barrier to optimal collaboration. And then, right now, there's not agreed upon apples to apples comparisons. So I would say, even though things like stage is well established, histopathologic characteristics are well established, if you want to look at other determinants that might influence outcome or even quality metrics, right now there's no parsimony in that field in oncology. You have ASCO, who's led with the COPI initiative, and you have others that have led with QDACT and HEDIS measures and other things. So how we measure quality to try to look at patient outcomes is not parsimonious. And then the critical piece of that collaboration is we've not done a great job yet of incorporating the patient story. And so I think we'll get there. I think that there's a great deal of interest in the patient-reported outcomes tools, so patients can characterize their quality of life, characterize their toxicity, and how their treatment and disease impacts their quality of life. And then also sensor technology. We all sort of know of the Fitbit and the 2-vector accelerometer and the sleep characterization, but we know the tech exists for things like sodium measurement, a 12-vector accelerometer, glucose measurement. If we're going to give grandma chemotherapy, let's check her postural instability before she falls and breaks her hip. So I think that patient piece also needs to come in. And I think the tech is there. We're just not exactly ready for it yet. And I'd love for people to talk about how we can get there, because I think that's an important gap to close.
Yes, so it's often the way that the technology advances ahead of the culture and systems and structures that are there to deal with it. So actually there's a question to industry and academia and R&D in the academic sector, is how ready and if anyone in the audience, or maybe you could comment, how ready are such systems to accept this way of researching? Because it's very different from how research used to be done, or is done.
I think it's one of the dilemmas around transformation, because we tend to think about transformation meaning everybody else has got to change so I can do what I want to do. Yeah. Where, the reality is that data changes everything, I think. It changes how I think about, most of us are trained as health services researchers to basically go out, recognize where there's an event of interest, and create data around it that then we can analyze. It's the direct analog to being a hunter-gatherer. But when you think about what happens with abundant data, with signal being associated with just the processes of care without having to do that hunter-gatherer thing, the role of the researcher looks much more like somebody who's harvesting information than a hunter-gatherer. And I think we need to recognize that the anthropologic implications of that transformation are profound in terms of who can do it, what it takes for infrastructure, the training that they need, the just what is the professional identity of folks who do that. So I think that there are places obviously that are dealing with this, but I think that it's a real challenge, because I think it disrupts how all of us go about our business.
And to take that analogy just a little bit further, I'll say that when we think about prospective clinical trials, so sort of the hunter in the picture, it's incredibly expensive. So while critically important, obviously critically important for cancer progress, it's much cheaper in terms of energy expense to gather the information from data that's already there, as opposed to go out and do it in a prospective clinical trial. And you can think of a comparison like that I can think in my mind of a recent phase 2 clinical trial that was enrolled 12 patients, and it was equal to cost to a prospective clinical trial that had 2,000 patients. Retrospective data search that had 2,000 patients with chart reviews. And so, just the cost there, as we think about our tremendous cost, and as the age distribution of the population changes, and we're at 18% of our GDP, we know that the cost is important, that we are good stewards. And we need to have a little more hunting and gathering.
Well, I worry that we have to go from being hunter-gatherers to being industrial farmers, but I think that is sort of the challenge, and I think that's where people are stepping up.
I'd add to that, there has been a sea change, and many of you in the room were part of that. There has been a tradition that we're all aware that in the pharmaceutical industry, you only have tomorrow if you have IT today. And what are you going to do? Give your IT away? That gives away your future. So whatever there was in a clinical trial, data, your data, that was privileged, that was privy, and that was protected. for all those reasons. Besides, the lawyers wouldn't let you move it. Well, at the CEO Roundtable, populated, as I said, by chief executive officers, the question was posed, why is it that you all sit on all of this data? Tell us what you really discovered from it, or even better, is this the intention of all those patients who volunteered for those clinical trials to have their data sitting in a reliquary? Or was it really the intention that it would be living data, although they may have died, that would be benefited society? Well, you know the answer.
Sure.
And the CEOs around the table answered that question and said, let's do it. That was a huge shift. When all of a sudden they are telling the attorneys on the companies, find ways to get this done. I'm not minimizing 3.5 years of legal work that enabled these codicils to be written and protected the privacy of the patients, obviously, but also of those companies. But it's not only a work in progress, it's a fait accompli in many companies that are having these data flow. So there's a gathering there for sure.